Marshal Grouchy's cavalry scouts found the Prussians at dawn on June 18, 1815, and for once a French commander acted without waiting for orders. The Prussian III Corps under General von Thielemann was strung along the western bank of the River Dyle at Wavre, exhausted from its retreat after the mauling at Ligny 2 days prior. Blücher's 4th Corps under Bülow was still further east, trying to cross the river and march west to honor the Field Marshal's promise to Wellington, 2 corps at Waterloo by midday. That promise was about to die on the riverbank. Grouchy had roughly 33,000 men. He should have been hours behind the Prussians in real history he was. But in this telling, we examine what could have happened had Grouchy shown the initiative his emperor always demanded, and why the real history unfolded so differently. Grouchy recognized what Thielemann's rearguard position meant. The Prussians were not just retreating, they were pivoting, wheeling westward toward the distant thunder of guns at Mont-Saint-Jean. If Bülow's corps crossed the Dyle and joined Blücher's march, Napoleon would face 2 armies converging on him simultaneously. Grouchy chose not to let that happen. He launched Vandamme's 3 Corps straight at Thielemann's defensive line along the river, while swinging Gérard's 4th Corps south to threaten the bridges Bülow needed. The Prussians fought hard. Thielemann's men held the stone bridge at Wavre for nearly 2 hours, but Vandamme's artillery found enfilading positions on the high ground east of town and began methodically destroying the barricades. When French infantry finally stormed across the bridge, the Prussian 3 Corps broke. Not a rout, a fracturing units peeling away in different directions, cohesion gone. Bülow, hearing the collapse behind him, faced an impossible choice: continue his march to Wellington and leave his flank exposed to 33,000 French troops, or turn and fight. He turned. By noon, both Prussian corps were locked in a battle they could not win, 12 miles from where Wellington desperately needed them. But the question of what was happening at those 12 miles to the west, that was where the fate of Europe was being decided. Wellington had chosen his ground well. The ridge at Mont-Saint-Jean offered a reverse slope that sheltered his infantry from direct artillery fire, and the fortified farmhouses of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte anchored his flanks. He had roughly 68,000 troops, but the quality was uneven. His British regiments were professional and steady, but they were outnumbered by Dutch-Belgian conscripts and Hanoverian militia who had never faced Napoleon's veterans. Wellington knew this. He had told his staff that he could hold until evening if Blücher came. Blücher did not come. By 2 in the afternoon, Napoleon sensed the absence. No Prussian columns appeared on the eastern horizon, no dust clouds rising from the Ohain road. For the first time in the battle, Napoleon smiled, or so the legend would later claim. He ordered Marshal Ney to take La Haye-Sainte at any cost. Ney threw everything at the farmhouse. The King's German Legion defenders, who had held it since morning, ran out of ammunition by mid-afternoon. When La Haye-Sainte fell, it punched a hole in Wellington's center that the Anglo-Allied line could not repair. Napoleon fed in d'Erlon's corps, reformed after its earlier repulse, and behind them came the Imperial Guard, not in the desperate twilight gamble of real history, but in a calculated late-afternoon assault with fresh reserves on either flank. Wellington's center buckled. The Dutch-Belgian brigades broke first, streaming northward toward Brussels. The Hanoverian militia followed. By 7 in the evening, with no sign of Prussian relief, and his line collapsing from the center outward, Wellington gave the order no British commander ever wants to give: general retreat, toward Brussels, toward the coast. The retreat from Mont-Saint-Jean was not the orderly withdrawal of a professional army. It was a disintegration. Wellington's British regiments maintained discipline. The Guards and the Highlanders fell back in squares, bayonets out, daring the French cavalry to charge, but the coalition units around them simply dissolved. Dutch-Belgian troops threw away their muskets and disappeared into the countryside. Hanoverian units fragmented into company-sized groups, stumbling north through the forest of Soignes. Napoleon pursued, but carefully. He sent Ney's cavalry after the retreating columns while keeping his infantry in good order on the main road. He had learned from Moscow. A reckless pursuit could exhaust his army as surely as a defeat. Brussels fell on June 20 without a shot fired. The city's population, which had danced at the Duchess of Richmond's ball just 4 nights earlier, woke to find French tricolors flying from the Hôtel de Ville. Wellington, with perhaps 25,000 effective troops remaining mostly British, fell back to Antwerp and began organizing an evacuation by sea. The Anglo-Allied army that had marched into Belgium with such confidence was finished as a fighting force, and word was already racing south to Vienna, where the coalition that had brought down Napoleon once before was about to fracture. The news reached Vienna in stages. First came rumors, unreliable, contradictory. Then dispatches confirmed the worst. Wellington defeated. Brussels taken. Blücher's army shattered at Wavre, the field marshal himself barely escaping with a cavalry escort. The Congress of Vienna, which had spent months carefully rebuilding Europe's order, descended into recrimination. Britain acted first, and most decisively. Lord Liverpool's government ordered the surviving forces evacuated from Antwerp. The Royal Navy could keep the Channel secure, and the British public, already weary of continental entanglements after 20 years of war, had no appetite for another invasion of France. Prussia, with 2 corps destroyed and the remaining 2 in no condition to advance, could not mount an offensive alone. King Frederick William III sent urgent appeals to Austria and Russia, but those armies were still mobilizing along the Rhine. Schwarzenberg's Austrians would not be ready until mid-July, at the earliest. Barclay de Tolly's Russians were further still. The coalition faced a grim arithmetic. To defeat Napoleon now would require a campaign of months, not weeks, fought without British ground forces and with the memory of Waterloo hanging over every soldier who marched west. Metternich, ever the pragmatist, began asking a different question. Not how to destroy Napoleon, but what terms he might accept. Napoleon understood his position with the clarity of a man who had lost an empire once before. He had won a spectacular victory, but France was exhausted. The treasury was bare. The army that had triumphed at Waterloo could not simultaneously garrison Belgium, defend the Rhine, and march into Germany. He needed peace, and he needed it before Austria and Russia finished mobilizing. He made 2 moves simultaneously. First, he recalled Talleyrand, the great survivor, the man who had served the Revolution, the Directory, the Empire, and the Bourbons with equal aplomb. Talleyrand accepted, because Talleyrand always accepted when power called. Second, Napoleon drafted his terms, and they were notably restrained. France would keep its natural frontiers, the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees. Belgium and Luxembourg would remain French. The left bank of the Rhine, lost in 1814, would return to Paris. In exchange, Napoleon renounced all claims to Italy, to Spain, to the German states east of the Rhine. He offered to recognize the independence of the German Confederation. He guaranteed British naval supremacy and colonial holdings. It was, by Napoleonic standards, modest. But it was the offer of a man who knew that the alternative, another grinding war against all of Europe, would destroy everything he had just won. The negotiations took 6 weeks, held in the neutral city of Aachen, and they were brutal. Talleyrand proved as masterful as ever, exploiting every fracture in the coalition. He played Britain's desire for peace against Austria's territorial ambitions, and Russian pride against Prussian humiliation. Metternich resisted longest, understanding that a France extending to the Rhine would dominate Western Europe for a generation. But Metternich was also a realist. Austria's army had not fought, and Franz had no desire to spend it on a campaign to restore the Bourbons, a dynasty Austria had never particularly loved. Russia's Tsar Alexander, who fancied himself Europe's moral arbiter, initially demanded Napoleon's abdication as a precondition. Talleyrand simply waited. When Russian and Austrian mobilization costs mounted without a shot fired, Alexander's moral certainty softened into diplomatic flexibility. The Treaty of Aachen was signed on August 4, 1815. France retained Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Rhineland. The Bourbon Restoration was formally abandoned. Louis XVIII, still in exile in Ghent, received the news in silence. Britain kept Malta, the Cape Colony, and its maritime dominance. Prussia accepted its diminished borders in exchange for Russian guarantees of its eastern territories. The map of Europe had been redrawn, not by a congress of diplomats, but by a cavalry charge at Wavre and a broken line at Mont-Saint-Jean. The years that followed were Napoleon's quietest, and perhaps his most consequential. He turned from conquest to consolidation, extending the Napoleonic Code across Belgium and the Rhineland with a thoroughness his military campaigns had never allowed. The Code's guarantees of property rights, civil equality, and secular governance transformed the annexed territories from occupied provinces into functioning parts of the French state. Trade along the Rhine flourished. The port of Antwerp became one of Europe's busiest. Napoleon rebuilt his army carefully, maintaining a force of 400,000 that could deter but not provoke. He established military academies, modernized artillery production, and invested in the road network that connected Paris to its new eastern frontier. Most critically, he focused on the succession. His son, the King of Rome, now styled as the Prince Imperial, received an education designed to prepare him for the throne. The boy learned statecraft from Talleyrand, military science from Marshal Soult, and administration from a cadre of prefects who had governed Napoleon's empire at its height. But an empire built around one man's genius carries a structural flaw that no amount of preparation can fully repair. Napoleon's marshals aged. His veterans, the grognards who had marched from Austerlitz to Waterloo, could not be replaced by conscripts who had never heard a cannon fired in anger, and the emperor himself, entering his 50s, began to feel the weight of years spent on horseback and in campaign tents. By 1821, the stomach pains that had plagued Napoleon for years could no longer be dismissed as the price of rich food and campaign stress. His physicians prescribed rest. Napoleon ignored them, as he ignored most advice that suggested limitation. But the court noticed what the emperor would not admit: the graying skin, the weight loss, the afternoons spent resting instead of working. In the real timeline, Napoleon Bonaparte died on Saint Helena on May 5, 1821, a prisoner and an exile. In this timeline, he remained an emperor, but the ailment did not care about titles. Succession consumed European diplomacy. The Prince Imperial was 16, old enough to inherit, too young to command the loyalty that his father's battlefield legend had earned. Metternich watched from Vienna with the patience of a man who understood that time was the coalition's greatest weapon. Prussia rebuilt. Russia expanded eastward while keeping one eye on the Rhine. Britain, secure behind its navy, traded with everyone and committed to no one. The Bonapartist Empire had achieved something remarkable: a negotiated peace that preserved French dominance west of the Rhine for a generation. But it had also created something fragile: a European order that depended not on the balance of power that Metternich had designed at Vienna, but on the health and judgment of a single man in the Tuileries. And that man was dying. The great question of European politics was no longer whether the Bonapartist order would endure. It was what would replace it when it fell, and whether the transition would come through diplomacy or through the same violence that had created it. The veterans of Waterloo, growing old in their garrison towns along the Rhine, understood this better than anyone. They had won the war that was supposed to end all wars. They were wise enough to know that no war ever does.